Hey, y'all, we're about to get started, so you could grab your seats. We'll start in like another minute. All right. Hi, everyone. Hi. All right. As I was taught today, all right, don't cancel me. Nga kasama. How did I do? Did I do all right? All right, I'm not canceled. Hi, everyone. My name is Saidi. I'm the education coordinator here at the People's Forum. If you haven't been to the People's Forum before, welcome. We're a space for political education and cultural work, and we do a lot of really cool programming. Speaking of really cool programming, what are y'all doing on March 18th? I have the answer. You're coming with us. A bunch of thousands of comrades are joining us are organizing these large anti-war demonstrations in DC this weekend, and we're joining them. And y'all should join us. So I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end. But yeah, stay tuned. Thank you all so much for coming out today. Today is really, really, really exciting. We're celebrating the launch of the book, Half Remembered Dreams of a Third World Son. This is super duper duper exciting, not only because this is really important work, but because Mike is a very close comrade of our space. So we're really excited to celebrate you and your work and just the amount of dedication you put into your work. So thank you. So as you know, we have Mike Legaspi, who is a language instructor, writer, and active community organizer for over the past decade. And we also have Ari here from the New York Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. So this is going to be a really beautiful, tender, active, just a whole bunch of really inspiring feelings. Conversation. So thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to pass it over to Mike and Ari.
Thanks a lot, Sadie.
Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks to People's Forum and to 1804 Books for putting this together. Can you all hear us all right? Or you want?
Yeah, can you hear me? Oh yeah, you can hear me.
Yeah,
I can hear me. So
Ari's a pro. Ari's a pro at this. I'm not. I'm just like trying to figure it out.
I feel like I've done so many panels where like I've had so many mic mishaps happen that I know. Anyway, I'm a professional basically.
I have my own mic mishaps.
Yeah,
but
that's pretty good.
Ari, did you want to introduce yourself a little bit more and talk about Night Chirp and what we're about to do here?
Yeah, this is where it gets serious. No, well, so I'm an organizer with Night Chirp. I've been an organizer with Night Chirp for about 3 years. But aside from my own personal work, Night Chirp is really kind of a very expansive organization. Like the very long acronym says, New York Committee for Human Rights in the Philippines. But I always put like a little asterisk mark, and we're always constantly in conversation about this, and we'll talk about this as well. Like we definitely say human rights, but I think very more to the core of that, it's like people's rights. Like it's like very particularly like working class, oppressed, peasant rights. And we'll talk about kind of like the sort of angling in of just working in the Philippines or working within diaspora and working internationally, but we really also focus on international solidarity as well. So yeah, we do a lot of different things.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Yeah.
And I know, thanks for being here, Ari. And thanks to Nitro comrades for also setting up a lot of or preparing for tonight. I promise I'm prepared too. But what we're gonna be doing tonight, we're gonna have this conversation. Ari has his not coffee, his tea. It's very calming. And we're gonna talk about the book. I believe that's what we're here to do. But we're also gonna be talking about a few things that inspired it, right? So thanks, folks, for coming out and listening to our discussion here. But we also do hope to have sort of like a discussion with everybody who came out here. Like not just a question and answer, but a lively discussion. Please, give us input, give us feedback, that kind of thing about the things that we're going to be talking about tonight. We're going to do a couple readings, or I'm going to do a couple readings,
Yeah,
and then and then we're going to talk about the things that inspired those readings, particular to growing up in a country like the Philippines and then moving here at a young age, right? We're going to start with, actually first, maybe I can ask folks, who here has, this is like your first time here at the People's Forum. You could raise your hand. Okay, a good number of folks. That's great. Thanks for coming out to the People's Forum. If you see, it's a place where different people's organizations can come together, learn from one another, and build solidarity with each other. So I'm so glad that that you all came out tonight. And again, thanks to them for hosting this and putting this together. The first reading that we're going to look at really starts with sort of framing rural life in the Philippines, right? The majority of the Filipino people live in the countryside, about 75% of the country, right? Right now, a lot of folks understand that the Philippines is a very agricultural nation, right? But what does that actually mean beyond, statistics, beyond numbers, beyond the percentage that I just quoted there? So I'm going to read, if it's all right, Ari. I'm going to read first poem from tonight from the book. I'm not going to read all the poems in the book. It's not a very long book, but I'm going to read just a few, and then I'm going to also read something that I'd written yesterday in preparation for this tonight. So I'm going to start with Through the Tall Grass. How wonderful it is to be among the tall grass, at a time when it towered above one's head, when one's playmates were the droning dragonflies and fattened frogs and field mice, fleeing the sound of bare brown feet, running, running, running through the tall grass, looking at the sunlit sky, the clouds crawling across the blue, the smell of damp, healthy greens, the splashing sound of the village creek, flowing, flowing, flowing past the tall grass, following the panting dogs, the swift, silent steps of a barrio cat, the whistling, warbling, wild, willful calls of the grass birds as they glide in and out of the tall grass, ultimately to reunite with the sky, soaring, soaring, soaring high above the tall grass. God's green grasslands grow with all this wonder and all this life. One feels so at home. That's Through the Tall Grass. Thank you. A lot of that is inspired by the lived experience growing up in southern Tagalog region, Calabarzon for a lot of folks, right? I grew up in Laguna in the Philippines until my early teens before I moved here. I'm going to talk about the moving here aspect. In our preparation, we're talking about like the sort of the oneness of living in the Philippines, growing up in the Philippines, but also how Filipinos overseas, whether it's in the U.S. or other parts of the world, are actually part and parcel of the struggles and the lived experiences of Filipinos in the Philippines, right? But one thing about rural life that often gets talked about are these sort of quaint images. And I'm being a little hypocritical because I'm talking about through the tall grass and I'm talking about these sort of nice, calm images, right? I was thinking of what I could add here to the poem. When I was writing it, I was thinking like, should I talk about the chickens that used to run in and out of our house when I was a kid? The chickens that were going to be tinola later on, or adobo. By the way, apparently, according to Google, it's like Filipino Adobo Day or something, which is a little weird. I feel a little singled out, but I was talking about it with Kate too. I think they recognize this. I guess that's good. But yeah, chickens running around our house, carabaos hauling goods down the dirt roads that were in front of our house, that kind of thing, right? Rural life, goats roaming through the halls of my school when I was a child. Those were the types of things that I wanted to put in that poem, but quite frankly, I ran out of space, and I realized once I finished that poem, once I finished writing it, that I wanted it to be the very first one, because that's the typical sort of theme that we hear about rural life in the Philippines. We're going to get into other things later on, but the way I wrote it in my outline is like rural life. That is often rural life. Chickens running around house, goats roaming halls of my school, but also rural life. Landlord goons, for example, terrorizing people throughout the countryside. I was witness to what people call a salvaging at the age of 8, which is an extrajudicial killing, right? I grew up in a time of Gloria Arroyo. The Gloria Arroyo presidency was particularly brutal, even though we know that every presidency, and we'll look at some data later on, but every single presidency in the Philippines in this current system is absolutely brutal in the countryside. So while there are these beautiful scenes about the tall grass, we need to also remember what's going on within the tall grass, because oftentimes that's where literal dumping grounds of corpses of people who've been extrajudicially killed end up, and that's a type of human rights situation and political crisis that we're dealing with in the Philippines. But I wanted to start there.
Yeah, actually, that was one of the questions that I had. I like reading, because I've read this a few times now, but like, yeah, this is before I knew I was going to talk on the panel. I was like, 4th time, let's do it. Taking this roller coaster again. No, I think, and like, not to inject too much of myself in this, but like, we talked about this, like my family's from Kosovo and like all peasants and farmers. And I think there's like definitely a romantic like perception of the farm. But then like when you have to go to like, when they're like, oh, I need to go to the bathroom, and they're like, oh yeah, and they point to like a hole with like a shack over it, and you're like, oh yeah, this is what happens when there's like no active plumbing, and like, like you're always having to wear boots through like lots of like horse manure and stuff, and like cow manure. Like, I think how was that balancing it? Because there is obviously like a lot of beauty in it, like the poem that you had, but like the reality is like, I always imagine like there's like humor, laughter, but then it's like punctuated always by like poverty and violence and stuff, especially in the Philippines, where like, there is a stigma against like the peasant life. And I think like, especially under Duterte, it became like super targeted. But like even before that has always been targeted for like, suspicion and being like, oh, like that's where all the communists are, or like the army's enemies, Like, how was that writing that, like this experience, I guess?
Well, first of all, thank you for reading it 4 times, you said?
Yeah, no, okay, 3 times. But yeah, little obsessed. I'm a big Mike fan.
No. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we think about, and one of the things that's sort of like, what's the word? Like it irks me. Parang nakakaasar. Some folks are laughing because I'm like translating in my head. One of the things that irks me is when people do romanticize the Philippines, particularly rural life, right? It is beautiful, and there's many things that are beautiful, and there's many conceptions of what is poverty, right? And like, Bob Marley once asked, "Do possessions make you rich?" That kind of thing, right? And of course, we want to challenge dominant notions of wealth and poverty, but at the same time, it may be beautiful in many respects, but there's a reason why Filipino people are also resisting against these structures of oppression and exploitation. We don't want to live like this. We don't want to live like this forever. We don't want to only live like this. We want to have a little bit more options, right? We're going to talk about later on about why people migrate in the first place, right? Why is it that, at the height of migration out of the Philippines, right, there were 7,000 Filipinos, 7,000 families every single day getting torn apart, right? Why is that, right? While it's true that a lot of our people are very resilient, and while it's true that there's a lot of beauty in the Philippines, especially in rural life, it's let's not romanticize it is sort of the thing here. So yeah,
because I don't know if anyone else has read it 3 times, but it's divided into 4 sections, and I think that was like one of my first questions in that question was like, it's like daydreams, and then that's the first thing, and it kind of feels like it is like a dream, right? Like it feels like you're watching one of those like cheesy 90s movies and everything's like soft focus and it's sunlight and people like hand through grass, like a bank commercial, like hand through grass, but like it's real to you, right? Like it feels very visceral through like unemotional like landscape. It isn't just like being and then the chicken cawed in the morning, like these are like real things that you went through, but like the journey influences how you perceive that, right? Like why it's a daydream as opposed to like just a real life experience, right? Like it's like now you're like 4,000 or 5,000 miles away from home, looking back, and trying to like remember it, I imagine, right?
Yeah, no, that's. I'm glad the imagery sort of, because the chapter writing was very deliberate. I thought was very deliberate, and I'm glad that it came through at least, or it was understandable, right? But yeah, that's sort of the idea, right? That's sort of the idea that we're trying to get at. It is like half remembered dreams, right? And such actually, in my view, is the sort of the mental state that a lot of us who migrated at a young age feel. It's like, were we really there? Were we really home? And every time that we go back home, it feels itself like a dream within a dream, right? Oh shoot, we're back home. Oh, that's not, the Carabao were a lot bigger in my memory, right? That kind of thing, right? So those are the types of things that are happening. Incidentally, how many folks here have been to the Philippines, let's say in the last 6 years or so? Yeah, so a bunch of folks, right? And every time you go, it does sort of feel like it's too short. It's you don't have enough time, right? That's sort of another thing that a lot of us who migrated at a young age, we feel like this is home. We've been wrenched from it. We can't really hold on to. It's like trying to hold on to water, really.
Yeah.
But yeah,
it has that like kind of capacity. I feel like even talking to like my family about immigrating and being forced out of Yugoslavia, like it was always like like everything felt like kind of rose colored in a weird way, and it felt like kind of like grasping shadows in like this kind of sense of like they're real, you see them, but you can't grab them. They can't be with you here, especially in New York, right? Like such an industrialized, like capitalist, like metropole. But I think like it also says something. Your book kind of like reminds me of like a lot of like Amy Cesar and like the decolonial like poets and like Edward Said, who like kind of mentioned that that's how you critique imperialism, right? It's like diaspora and migrants who can critique it properly or critique it more in a contemporary sense because you're like you've made the move, like you've been pushed out of your home. But yeah, I mean, like I don't want to like lose the idea earlier about like we were talking about like the landowners and everything, because that's also I think such a massive part of like working on a farm and being part of a farm is like the people who gain from the farm and from farming and agriculture who aren't actually doing the work, right? Like that's why people are subjected in those places. And I think like from your perspective, do you feel like being separated from that now you can see it clearly, or do you think like it's harder for people back home to see it with this sort of perspective? Like,
I think that there's a role or a place for for folks in diaspora or folks overseas, however you want to term it, to be part of that discussion, right? To say how it's like being in sort of right here in New York, the belly of the imperialist beast, but also knowing how it was in our home countries. So there's something to be said for having that conversation for sure. But you did mention New York, right? And the adjustment that it takes. So that'll bring us to the next poem, the poem that the book is named after. Actually, it's Half Remembered Dreams of a Third World Son. With calloused palms, I scratch my face as I hold my head in my hands. It's all been a blur, like half-remembered dreams stitched together like a quilt of memories. Bruised knuckles, bleeding lips, desperate teenage love, cold airplane cabins, passports, too many lights, too many cars, cops chewing gum and sneering, languages I can't understand, a boulevard of death, a thundering train, cans of spam, calling cards to home, heavy accents, black, brown, red, yellow, pink, flags and skin, being 16 and cleaning up construction sites for the rich white suburbanites at $5 an hour and a sandwich. Protests, human trafficking, broken streetlights, missing girls. Kitchen crews on smoke breaks, potholes, sex workers, abandoned lots, wage theft, mariachi bands, homeless elders, gangs, cops, territories, precincts, bomb scares, school shootings, street shootings, subway shootings, showtime, missing home, making home, city parks, high rises, bus routes, midsummer fireworks, midsummer garbage smell. Tim's on ice, Chuck's on gravel, dog walkers, pigeon shit, mamitas, rolled joints, piano music overhead, yelling, yelling, yelling. Dollar slices, General Cho, moving out, haircuts, blackouts, cracked sidewalk, remittances, rent, rent, rent. Stitched together like a quilt of memories, like half-remembered dreams. It's all been a blur. As I hold my head in my hands, I scratch my face with my calloused palms. It's half-remembered dreams of a third world son. I always, so I practice reading it to myself at home, especially when I wrote it. I'm thinking like, should I breathe at some point? Because holding all that is like not breathing through all that, right? And a lot of that is, again, just snippets or just blurs of or blurred memory of that young migrant experience, right? From the bruised knuckles and the bleeding lips to the working these construction cleanup jobs at 16 for $5 an hour and a sandwich. I'm actually going to mention my brother over here, Gustavo. If you wouldn't mind. Gustavo came through. I'm glad you came through. Actually, I was surprised and very glad that you're here, because he and I actually worked one of those jobs when we were in our teens. I was still in high school. I think you had just graduated before me, and we were with another friend who, we worked out in Long Island to clean basically construction sites. We had to clean those up for $5 an hour and a Subway sandwich, right? And that's the type of stuff that they gave Gustavo, you're from Argentina, right? That's the type of stuff that they gave to immigrant kids, right? Those are the types of jobs they gave to immigrant kids. And we were like, 16, 17, $5 an hour and a Subway sandwich, working like 12-hour days out in Long Island. And then they'd spit us back out here in a van, And those are the types of things that, we come from, the so-called third world. We get over here, and this is the better life that our parents said was going to happen here. That's our quote unquote better life,
How many years ago was that?
Okay, let me see.
I'm not trying to date you right now.
I'm 30 now. That's fine.
I'm 32,
30,
so
okay.
It's okay.
So
I got you.
when I was 16, so around that time.
Yeah. Well, and you definitely want to get on to the next point, but it's interesting. Like I think like the New York Times just released like this whole study on saying like migrant children, children of immigrants, are in being forced into precarious labor. Meanwhile, like in Arkansas, they're like the child labor laws are getting repealed, but it feels like always there's like that the like migrant immigrant community and oppressed communities, third world communities that get forgotten in those statistics. Like, yeah, like labor laws get appealed, but that's like for people who like are documented or for people who aren't having issues with the state and finding asylum and things like that. Like, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's for sure. And it just made me think about how, like, in a lot of mainstream discourse, even on social media, a lot of folks talk about like, oh, millennials and for sure Gen Z, right, are like in a very precarious position economically. And that's true, but it's also like, and we're millennials still, and that's true, but it's always been like that, especially for children of migrants from folks from working class migrant families. We've always had to think about, all right, what's the next hustle? What's the next plan? Because that thing that we did, it wasn't very long. It's not very lucrative, but we didn't do it for a long time. So we had to keep thinking about what's the next thing, right? What's the next? Oh, there's an opening at this restaurant, that kind of thing. Dom's here also, who I worked with in a restaurant downtown, and that restaurant, hey Dom, This is how I make the nervousness of tonight go away. I keep pointing at people in the audience. I'm like, that person, look at that person.
The friends you invited, you guys should come to my show. And then like they come, and then you just like make it about them. Yeah.
Yeah. It's about Dom and Gustavo right now, but yeah.
He just gets up.
Right. But no, I mean some of the places that we worked at, I've worked at multiple restaurants, but one of the restaurants that we worked at downtown, thanks for getting me that job, by the way, is, there was a chain of Filipino migrants working there. It was, they weren't all kasamas or comrades, right? But there was a bunch of folks who were, from the Philippines, young migrants or migrated relatively young, and, we're all just working there. And that's how you survive, and it's always been like that though,
Yep. And that's also like, I mean, it's interesting. It's obviously horrible, but like that is also the working situation on like the colonial periphery, right? Like in the Philippines right now, I think like we were talking about that article where it's like 1.7 million people have been put out of precarious labor, like not even like secure labor. It's like almost 2 million people in a month's time period. And like Marcos is going on these tours and be like, oh, labor, like we're doing so great. Everyone has jobs. But literally 2 million people in like less than a month's time lost their job, like going into January 2023. Like, it feels like like you're jumping from like one sinking ship into another more progressively. Like half of the ship is sinking, but somehow it's staying afloat, like in America, where it's like, yeah.
No, that's for sure. I mean, folks know this. Everybody here, I'm sure, knows this in some respect, right? In some way, the precariousness of it all. But, I was just, as I was preparing for this, I was like, all right, think, try to remember, because everything is a blur. Like, try to remember, in between restaurant jobs, I was busking on the B&D train, that kind of thing, right? It's not super lucrative. I guess I'm not that talented, but people were really generous. They gave me money for playing guitar on the train. But
I thought you were gonna say Showtime because you mentioned show. I was like, Mike,
I'm not
dancer.
that skilled,
Yeah.
But like it's that precarious, and you'll see folks do this. There's this notion that the working class is this sort of how do you call that? The unionized working class, and there's a very specific, to be frank, quite white mold for what a lot of folks think in the United States, at least, think is the working class. But oftentimes it's like our parents and ourselves trying to survive against the might of capital, trying to hold up the entire system, basically.
Yeah, and it's also like I think like Americans have like our reading of class structure is so different. And again, like I feel like we were like very much having this conversation before this conversation. We were talking about this, but like Americans, like for example, like indigenous communities will like always be like, oh, the working class, and then like indigenous people and like reservations are outside of that, like as if they aren't colonial subjects and they aren't like working class people or like oppressed, like if you want to get like particular about it, like lumpen proletariat, like, but the other thing too is that like, and speaking to like some of the things that we do as Night Chirp is like, we want, especially in this year, like, I think the biggest way, and a lot of our comrades in Kasamas kind of feel this way, is that you don't see it. And it sucks that like you have to like, you can't even like watch a video. You can like emotionally empathize with the video, but like to live in it and be in those conditions, like the actual conditions, like you need to actually do that. Like, and that's kind of something that we were really focused on, is doing Expo, which kind of stopped for a lot of like the Bion and different organizations here, is like going back and like talking to people and like hearing them, because like when people come here, labor organizers come here, they have so much to say. And when we did our panel last year, like Anne, who's part of Bien, she was like so profuse about meeting one-on-one with labor organizers. And like I think that is actually like international labor solidarity and worker solidarity, as opposed to just being like, yeah, like I read Marx and blah, blah, blah. Like, you know what I mean? Like sitting in your room, but it's like actually going out there and talking to people and like, you know what I mean? Like culturally engaging with things like your poetry and etc. Yeah.
No, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely a lot to be said about like, how do we view working class struggles and the working class, right? That's not to say, I know I did a quick dig at unions earlier. That's not to say that unionizing in and of itself, but actually you mentioned Bien is a good example. In the Philippines, labor organizing is very, the clear splits are there between what we understand as red unions, right? Unions, militant unions that actually challenge capital and go to blows with capital, right? Versus the bosses unions, which, unfortunately in much of the, you mentioned the word peripheries, the other side of peripheries is the centers, right? Unfortunately, in a lot of the centers of capital are the dominant form for now, right? So yeah, there's a lot to be, I feel like we'd go on a whole tangent
we get,
that,
yeah. Even with just like the red unions and stuff, like, yeah, there's more. And we're probably going to talk about it.
Yeah. The next sort of reading that I want to sort of what I want to do is it's going to talk a little bit about mental health, right? But it's also going to open it up to mental health, the mental health crisis of Filipinos, both in the Philippines and abroad, as well as the socioeconomic roots. Since we're talking about, we were just talking about the working class. We're talking about coming from the Philippines. We're talking about being the situation of a lot of young migrants, right? Or the how do you call that? The perspective of a lot of young migrants, right? Certainly not all, but a lot. Now, I'm hoping we could sort of take a little bit of a dive into what it means, how it affects a lot of us in terms of our mental health, really. So this is called Walking Through the Hallways of Your Mind. And oops, that's not it. I'd dedicated this to three kasamas, right? Yeah, I'll just go ahead and read it. I don't know what else to say after that, but I step with as steady and as measured a pace as I can muster, one foot followed by the other, careful not to trip, careful not to slip, as I search for you in the hallways of your mind. Some rooms I pass are dark, other halls are brightly lit. I search for you, signs of you, traces of you, through the labyrinth of your mind. My footsteps echo down the long passages, every inch of your mind made up of your thoughts, made up of your feelings, made up of the things you've gone through, made up of the things you're going through, made up of your life. The best I can do is keep searching, up every bright path and down every dark tunnel. My footfalls falling and echoing over the steep steps of the spiral staircase of your mind. Sometimes I find you joyfully strolling through bright gardens of your mind. Other times I find you tearfully sobbing, balled up and defeated in the darker, colder, hurting hiding places of your mind. I'm no builder, but I offer all I can if you accept. We can work bit by bit to build a place where you won't feel defeated. In the bright, hopeful, wonderful sanctuaries in your mind. I would offer my own mind as a refuge, but healing's a bit hard to come by among the dusty, broken ruins of my mind. That's walking through the hallways of your mind. So that's a bit of a downer, that one. but yeah, I mean, part of it is really thinking about how for a lot of us, in community, a lot of us in activist spaces too, right? We tend to become, we tend to lean on each other as much as possible, right? And the way that I was sort of visualizing, kasamas, comrades helping each other out is sort of like navigating the different hallways, the different spaces of one's mind, right? Or at least that's how, for me, it was helpful to think about it. But the reality is, it shouldn't just be up to us as community to hold each other, right? Right now, that's who we have. But it's largely because there aren't enough services, there aren't enough accessible, resources for us to help ourselves through some of the worst times in our lives, right? So we're largely forced to lean on each other and work together. And while that is good, just like when we were talking about, rural life, for example, while there's a lot that's good there, there's also a lot that's lacking. There's a lot that's still needed. That we're out here, we constantly need to fight for. So a few things that Ari and I were talking about earlier that I wanted to mention is, and this is from the World Health Organization, right, and other sources. In the Philippines, about 6 million Filipinos are confirmed, right? Out of 114 million total population, 6 million Filipinos are confirmed to have some form of depression and or anxiety, right? That's confirmed. But 15.4 million are estimated to have depression, which coincides with 15.3 million estimated to have to be facing addiction and substance abuse, right? I don't think I have to remind the folks in this room that this comes from 2022, about mid 2022, right when there was a change in government, right? I don't need to remind folks here that the Philippines and the Filipino people had just undergone 6 years of Rodrigo Duterte, who unleashed a drug war on quote unquote drug war, right? But it actually, instead of getting to the root causes of why people are doing drugs, and getting at the root causes of why people are depressed and why people are suffering, his solution was to kill 32,000 people, right? A lot of people cite the number 30,000. It's actually 32,000 plus people who were killed. And that's only the first 3 years of Duterte's presidency. More were murdered by the police since then, right? Now let's look at the actual government response aside from the drug war, right? Because a lot of Duterte supporters and honestly conservative Filipinos will say, well, a lot of them were committing crimes, blah blah blah. That kind of the usual fascist, anti-people sort of logic. Well, let's look at what else the government was doing. Only 5% of healthcare expenditure in the Philippines is towards mental health, right? Only 5% of the entire healthcare expenditure. Meanwhile, about $273 million, that's already, I already did the calculation for US dollars, about $273 million was reportedly stolen by executives at the PhilHealth Corporation that's in charge of, the healthcare for the vast majority of the 114 million Filipinos, right? And that 273 million was stolen in fraudulent schemes, right? Various kinds of fraudulent schemes, overpricing on test kits and so on like that during the pandemic, right? And again, only 5% of the healthcare budget that they stole from actually goes to things like mental health resources. So while the current Duterte Marcos regime are patting themselves on the back for enacting the first mental health law in Philippine history, we have to look at the facts here. Is that, they're actually not helping the vast majority of the Filipino people. So
Yeah.
if you wanted to say anything.
Well, yeah, I mean, like you touched on a lot of really important things. I think like fascists in general, like will pretend as if like, like medicine is something that like, like medicating yourself is something that makes you inherently evil, right? Because you're like polluting your body and you're not, ultimately productive. Like you can't go to a job, you can't work, and you can't produce. So therefore you're like invalid in the eyes of a fascist government. And I think like even like the stay at home order and all the things that happened in the Philippines during COVID and the sort of betrayal that happens when you use that to assassinate people, which is what he was doing, and oppress people even further. And that's like that's just like a major like reaction, right, to a disease is that, you quarantine. And that just in its own like simplistic level was betrayed on the behalf of the Filipino people. And like, how can a government hope to extend a hand like or an olive branch out to what they consider like terrorists when they're the only people that when they set up like guerrilla centers and stuff throughout the Filipino countryside providing that sort of aid. And on top of it, like the other part that I think like even on the left does not get centered enough. And like, when we talk about like Maoism and all that stuff, it's like Mao in the Chinese Revolution, like the very, very fundamental thing, we were talking about this earlier, was like disease in China. When the war was happening, Chinese Revolution was happening over like 16 years, was like radical medicine. And it was like making sure that people found like access to like traditional Chinese medicine, as well as like, advanced, more modern medicine as well. And I think like that's something like we always like, think of our revolution by the gun, but it's really revolution by like the bandage or the pill or the needle, you know what I mean? Because it's like, that's like really what needs to happen. Like we know we talk about Che Guevara, but Che Guevara before he became a guerrilla was like a doctor, And I think that that's something that's like super important to all of this is that like, you can't have a revolution if everyone's like sick, lost, depressed, like there is no like access to spaces. And like, what does liberation mean when you can like, you don't have a place that's actually a liberated space to like feel the benefits of it, Yeah. Damn. Thank you guys.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, we are going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the people's resistance, but actually that's already a really good point. Like when people talk about, for example, I mean, I grew up in the countryside, right? So when people hear the words, the name of the rebel army, as a lot of people call them, the New People's Army, when people hear that in the countryside, there are, of course, a number of people who are going to parrot what the Philippine government says, oh, they're terrorists or this and that, right? Then there are the folks in the countryside who are like, oh yeah, the New People's Army, the NPAs, they're like whatever Robin Hood figures, right? I had to when I came here, I realized that that's what's going on. That's like, and then there are the people who, if you ask them about the NPA, they'll be like, they won't talk about guns or the armed aspect of the Civil War because it's still a civil war. There are people who you'll ask, oh, what do you think about the NPA? They'll be like, oh yeah, they installed toilets for us last month, that kind of thing. Or they brought they brought vaccines to us 2 months ago, things like that. That's what people, of course, currently, right? Before it wasn't vaccines. It was things like toilets. It was things like a lot of other access to basic needs that the government wasn't providing. So, you're absolutely right that is, it's not always about, the revolution by literally the gun all the time.
And that's like, and yeah, we're going to totally talk about it, but that's also like the fact that one of the biggest labor exports that the Philippines has is nurses too, which is like almost like an even bigger slap in the face to like Filipino people, that like people leave the country to go be a part of a medical institution that is sorely needed in their own country. You know, I don't know, but
Yeah.
we'll talk about that.
Yeah, that induced need,
Yeah.
right? Or that manufactured need. But there's a few other things that are affecting us, and we started this part of our discussion about mental health, but there's quite a number of things that are affecting us both in the Philippines and overseas. But just I guess to wrap up the part about on the other side of the ocean, back home in the Philippines, right? They talk about, so we talked about the drug war. We talked about, how are people supposed to survive? How are people supposed to cope? This is the employment situation right now, right? Because like you said, Ari, the government sees it this way and fascists see it this way. If you're poor and you're doing drugs, you're completely useless to us. You're not contributing to society. That's how they view it, and that's how they talk about it, right? But let's look at the employment situation, right? Out of 114 million people, only 47.4% are employed in full-time. 47.4 million are employed in full-time regular jobs. That's less than 60% have some form of regular, what we can call stable kind of job, right? Out of 114 million people, only 47.4 million have what we could call a stable job, even by Philippine standards. The unemployment, according to the government, is 2.4 million people. However, folks who are underemployed are 6.7 million, right? So folks who have to have multiple jobs, including informal jobs. And the informal and or irregular employment, right? So like vendors, folks doing different kinds of jobs, not for a specific corporation or facility, right? Is at 34.5 million people, right? So you're looking at a massive number of folks who are, we were talking about the precarious situation here in the centers of global capital, but in the Philippines and many other countries around the world, many other countries that folks, so-called third world, right? Or what is it that the UN likes to call us? The developing countries or whatever, right? Developing towards what, right? The vast majority of people are already in that precarious situation, right? It's not anything new for our people, and of course that leads to severe socioeconomic crisis leads to a lot of how do you cope with that, basically, right? That question, how do we as a people cope with that, especially when as it affects migrants, right? And people migrating overseas. We already cited 7,000 people leaving the country daily. That means 7,000 families being torn apart by imperialism, by government neglect, right? So that's sort of the condition in the Philippines. When we get over here, right? When we get over to whatever countries we're migrating to, but here we'll use the U.S. as a sort of case, I guess a case study, right? Once we get over here, a lot of our parents, a lot of us as young migrants, we come over here, we look for work. I already talked about all the kinds of jobs that become available to a lot of us when we come here. A 2010 study showed that 98 to 99% of Filipinos in the U.S., 98 to 99%, I don't know why they made that distinction, but 98 to 99% of Filipinos in the U.S. have had some experience of daily, quote-unquote, daily or lifetime racism, which includes, of course, in the workplace, right? What does this lead to for a lot of us, especially, sort of rounding it back to mental health here, right? In the same period, throughout the 2010s, there was a statistic that came out. Folks actually studied it and found that suicidal ideation for Filipino girls and young women in the U.S. was the highest of any group throughout the 2010s, right? For Filipino girls and young women at 45.6%. And also the highest among any group of suicide attempts at 23.3%, right? These are the kinds of things that are the real concrete result of imperialism, of forced migration, of not being able to live in our homeland, right? This is, these are numbers right now, and through art, through poetry, through writing, and through music, we try to bring out how it feels, but the numbers are still there. The facts are still there. How is it that almost 50% of Filipino girls and young women have thought of ending their lives in the country that's supposed to be, our parents, and they're not necessarily lying, because sometimes our parents actually believe this stuff. And most of our parents believe this stuff. They say we're going to leave from our homeland because we will have a better life. But I don't know. The numbers show, when we talked about employment earlier, now we're talking about mental health, now we're talking about other things, that it's not actually the case that we have this better life. We used to have, what's that quote from, I can't believe I'm going to quote West Side Story right now.
No,
Hey,
you should.
when I first came here, I thought West Side Story was amazing. I saw it on
Like,
TV.
This is how it is in New York.
Yeah.
Oh.
But they said, back in, to borrow from a couple lines from West Side Story, and apply it to the Philippines. Back in the Philippines, we had nothing.
Yeah.
Now we have nothing still, but now it's more expensive. Now we have to pay more for this nothing. Now we have to pay more for that 98 to 99% of racism daily or lifetime, whatever that means, right?
Well,
So
it's like, I think it's also something like, in myself as like a first generation person, my dad's always like, like America is like a great country. There aren't any like paramilitaries like driving around trying to kill you, which is like also kind of an exaggeration, because like, as we have seen, that's not the case. I mean, this is like the homeland of paramilitaries, but like I think like that like skewed perception of like the two poles, right? Of like, well, this is better than over there, as if over there didn't come with you over here. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that that's something like that, like a way of framing is still a ramification of imperialism at home. Like, you are like obviously I don't like say this to my own father, and I'm sure like you don't go around being like, I am like the remnants of imperialism, but like there really is like, like, and it's like because it also kind of like, I'm sure we don't need to be censored here, but like fucks with you like walking around and thinking that way, right? Like it really like does a number on the way that you hold relationships, the way that you hold space for yourself. Like, if the spaces back home, the communities back home have been like the fibers that connect those communities have been ripped apart and like gutted, like, and the ability to heal and the ability to like actually be together is quite physically impossible, because like you're how many miles away, Sorry. Mic drop.
I'm like, I'm like trying to absorb everything. Yes, that's exactly the case that we're experiencing, right? And we were just talking about one aspect. We're talking about mental health so far, and also its relationship to our socioeconomic condition, right? We've talked about in the Philippines, but also over here, right? Here are some other community issues that we've had to face, right? And so I know that there's a few National Democratic activists here. Give a shout out. No. Okay.
Everyone I've looked at so far.
But a lot of folks are familiar with the term social investigation class analysis, right? So SICA, some folks say, right? Here's some of that, so-called social investigation, right? Filipino households, right? There's also this misrepresentation of income data, right? So Filipino households are among the highest earners in the U.S., right? Among the highest earners, right, per household, right? But that doesn't take into account the number of earners per household. That's not per person, right? So the U.S. Government data and statistics try to paint as if, Filipinos as a minority group, quote unquote, have made it, right? And this also feeds into larger things like beyond the Filipino community, like the model minority myth, right? But let's actually look at the data here. Let's disaggregate it, right? Filipino households are among the highest earners. That sounds like it would be good. That sounds like we would be doing fine, right? At least in the economic sense, and that would affect us, right? In a positive way, supposedly. However, it doesn't take into account how many earners are actually in Filipino households, right? Multi-generational households among Filipinos are at 34%, plus another 17% listed as quote-unquote other family members. So out of the entire 100% of Filipino households, that's 51% of Filipino households that are not just a couple or the nuclear family, right? The sort of Western concept of the nuclear family, 51%, right? Overall, the U.S. population of a multi-generational plus other family members is at 18%, right? So that means that this research, this data that was gathered by the U.S. government to sort of show, how different, the demographics of the country, the socioeconomic conditions of different demographics, is ridiculously skewed because they're comparing, they're comparing largely middle class white families that are usually, have 2, 3, maybe 4 people per household to families that a lot of us are familiar with, like 6, 8, 12 people per household. And our socioeconomic standing is the same. We know that's not true, right? So there's a lot to look at when it comes to that, right? Filipinos as cheap, expendable labor. This is something that we've talked about in other spaces, migrant organizing spaces, particularly migrante. During the period of COVID, right? During this period, 4% of registered nurses, right, are Filipino. 4% of registered nurses in the United States are Filipino. I know it seems like more. It feels like 80% or something, but no, it's actually 4%, right? It's just that, they look at Filipinos, particularly these private hospitals, so on, look at Filipinos as cheap, expendable labor, right? So only 4% of registered nurses are Filipino, but 25% of all COVID-related healthcare deaths have been Filipino healthcare workers, right? So that is an appalling, that's a ridiculous number, right? Not only the misrepresentation of data, right, to make it look like we're doing better than we actually are, but the outright ignoring of the plight and struggle of Filipino workers as expendable, cheap labor, just like a lot of our siblings from other countries in the so-called third world, right?
But yeah, it's also the racism within the hospital ward, right? Like it happens both within staff and with patients that come in, and it's something that it's very clearly, as the statistic shows, prevalent in the Filipino diaspora. But you can see it in so many other diasporas, particularly Puerto Rican diaspora, that doctors and nurses that are treated as expendable, and then patients who are also treated as expendable who end up dying because of malpractice, because they're just not seen, or they're seen in this very imperial racist mentality of because they're only seen for their labor and they're only seen for their bodies, that they're just you could take it, that, and that, not to jump from our protest movement into others, but huge thing in New York, particularly, you talk about West Side Story, not West Side Story is related to this, but the Young Lords organizing with radical Puerto Rican organizers and communists who occupied spaces because of those reasons, because they were seeing disproportionate amount of Puerto Ricans dying, from racism within the hospital room, and it's clearly connected. I mean, Puerto Rico and Philippines, I feel are connected so intimately in other ways, but in that way, unfortunately, as well, yeah.
And that reminds me, that was the topic of that event in December, the Treaty of Versailles. I think Nico, see, I keep doing this. Nico was
it's
speaking.
On you now, Nico.
Nico, come on down.
You thought the panel was done, huh?
But yeah, for sure, that close relationship, right? That unfortunately was forged by U.S. imperialism.
Mm-hmm.
But I guess on the flip side, we can think about it in another way of fighting back.
Yeah.
that relationship continues to be forged in fighting against U.S. imperialism.
And there's also like and you know, we also were talking about this before we got on stage, was like the fact that like Filipinos or Filipino diaspora have been in whatever like is considered the Americas or Turtle Island for far longer than like white settler colonists have ever been here. You know, like I think like the first Filipinos were in California, what, in like 1510 or something like that. So it's like on that level as well with like Puerto Rican diaspora and other indigenous communities is like often seen, and especially like in reservations and like, you know, BIA, like the Bureau of Indian Affairs, like that happens a lot with like in you know, schools and hospitals where indigenous people are often thought of as like secondary and only looked at as like after we get through all the white patients, essentially, you know?
Yeah. That's an interesting point, and it's a little bit of a tangent here, but I do want to say, no, I think it's good, because there's a reason why I both in writing, you know, whether it's more explicit political writing, folks have, I think at least 5 folks here have read statements that I've written in the past, insofar as they've been read. But I'm very deliberate in not calling folks Filipino Americans, right? Although, of course, you know, if folks want to identify as Filipino Americans, that's cool. It's totally up to you. But the logic here and something that I bring up to my students sometimes when I'm not supposed to be talking about, or not supposed to be so political in a language class, is that America doesn't love you. America doesn't love you. America doesn't love anybody America doesn't love anybody who looks like us. America doesn't love anybody, especially from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, right? And so this concept, right, of you know, building solidarity and building relationships outside of that colonial, outside of the colonial project of the United States is something that's much more, I think, much more important for us to look into, right? I actually don't consider the landing of, I forgot what they're called. I should know this because, you know, I studied history, but I don't consider that landing, Morro Bay, California, that's what they call it. Yeah. I don't consider that as the beginning of Filipino-American history, quote unquote, Filipino-American history. A lot of people do, a lot of institutions that try to sort of gain funds from the U.S. government look at that as the beginning of Filipino-American history. But actually that was part, any time that our people have contributed to a colonial project should not be seen as history worth celebrating, right? What's more worth celebrating is the coming together and building with indigenous communities in what is now San Malo, Louisiana, right? With indigenous and African communities who had broken free from slavery, right? And that was in the 1700s, right? So these kinds of things and cross-national and cross-cultural solidarity against imperialism, explicitly against imperialism, is the type of thing that, you know, I think that we want to be uplifting, right?
For sure. Yeah, definitely.
But part of the reason for that is, you know, sort of the last thing here when it comes to Filipinos in the US, right? Is the concept of incarceration and this another shared space between Filipinos and non-Filipinos in the borders of the United States, right? Something that doesn't get talked about is incarceration of Filipinos, right? In California and many other states, actually, but we're going to use California as one of the larger examples. Filipino men make up the largest number of incarcerated Asian men, right? The largest number in terms of sheer numbers, not in terms of percentage to population, right? The largest number of incarcerated Asian men in California are Filipinos, and make up in Hawaii, right? The U.S. colony that is really a kingdom, right? In Hawaii, 33% of juvenile arrests are Filipino. That's a massive number, 33%, right? Given that there are only about 4.5 million Filipinos in this country of, 337 million people now, right? So that's actually a massive number anywhere, right? But in California, many states, and in Hawaii, 33% of all juvenile arrests are Filipinos. A lot of this also has to do with precarious immigration status, right? an estimated 1 in 4 Filipinos in the U.S. is undocumented, right? A lot of us, there's this term. Have folks heard the term TNT? Not the explosive. Tago, what does it mean? Yeah, tago ng tago, always hiding, always in hiding. And that's actually the case of a lot of our folks. A lot of folks in the Filipino community, you would know somebody who's TNT or who's tago ng tago, no? Who's always in hiding from the government. This 1 in 4 Filipinos being undocumented in the U.S. makes us also number 5 in terms of undocumented migration from any country. We are number 5 in terms of undocumented immigration from any country, and we are actually number 1 in terms of folks who have to fly from another hemisphere to get to this hemisphere. We're actually number 1 in terms of that, right? That's what that number 5 in terms of undocumented migrant groups means, right? So, of course, this constant state of incarceration, this constant state of to borrow from the great revolutionary Frantz Fanon, right? The constant state of tension is what leads to what we were talking about in the first place when we read that poem. It leads to the mental health crisis that we have both as Filipinos in the Philippines, but certainly overseas. Life doesn't just get better just like that, right?
Yeah.
So those are some of the things that we have to face and contend with.
Yeah, and obviously, like when we talk about incarceration, we also have to mention like the PNP relationship with places like the NYPD, like LAPD, like Chicago PD, and the U.S. military, and like the sort of twisted internationalism that capitalism has, where it's like the Philippines, like the Marcos Duterte government now understands how many Filipinos abroad are part of working class movements, and how like the working class that they and the peasants that they suppress and kill and imprison and torture, they have to do that abroad as well with the cooperation of like their big like U.S. imperialists, like Papa, like essentially like helping them out, and that's really like it plays into the precarity as well. Like you go seeking labor, and that's what's the carrot that's dangled in front of your face, right? Like is like, oh, you want this? Well, here are all the obstacles, and then ultimately when you find some sort of employment, even if it's like precarious, like you can get jailed for it, and then you're like stuck in a system, like a perpetual system. Like when you become a convict, like it's harder to find better employment after that.
Absolutely. I mean, like a lot of us here know, right? Like this same Philippine National Police that killed 30,000 people in just about 3 years in a drug war. By the way, that's just that one operation. That doesn't even include other people that they killed for other reasons, right? But that same Philippine National Police that killed 32,000 people in the drug war, in Duterte's drug war, trains with the same New York Police Department. They literally train, they have a direct relationship. It's freaking insane. Yeah. They train directly with the New York Police Department, the same one that murders black and brown people here in this city every day. But it's not only that. You're right about this international solidarity that they have. These two, the PNP and the NYPD, also train closely with the Israeli Defense Forces that kill and colonize the lands of our Palestinian siblings every single day, right? So this is why whenever I hear about Filipino, like, oh, my cousin is going to be a cop, I'm just like, yeah. I got this visceral, all right, it's time to leave before I say something. You know what, maybe I should, that kind of thing is, you hate it, right? Because it happened, and it's fine to hate it, right? It's fine. It's the cops, who cares? Yeah.
Well, no, yeah, it's so funny. I like my aunt like basically called my mom the other day. It was like really sad. My mom was like, "What's going on?" And she's like, "Oh, my son is going to the New York Police Academy," and like it freaked my mom out because like I mean, if you talk about the police and like Muslim people, like we're very like tense, especially in New York. But anyway, that aside, like going back to like the Palestinian thing, for example, because that's like another situation with Palestinians abroad have such precarity. Forget like work, like they have precarity and identity, like. You know what I mean? Like, in order to be granted asylum, someone has to actually, like in the U.S., recognize that Palestine is a country. Do you know what I mean? And like, that's the way like the Zionist entity like monitors and tracks people, right? Is like, it follows Palestinians abroad. And like, tortures them in every capacity that it possibly can. And like, people end up like, the suicide thing becomes such a huge part of the Palestinian community since the Nakba because of that reason, because it's like you can't find a home. Like I think one author was saying that he had over 42 different homes, like Palestinian author from Ramallah. And it's like that's like insane. You know what I mean? Like the idea of home and like what that means, and like going back to your writing, like what that means. I think like James Baldwin says, like you can't forget to bring home wherever you go. And I think that's like super important, right? Because if you don't have like a sense of home, then like you feel completely dislodged, and like anyone can control you, anything can control you, any system can control you.
Absolutely. Yeah, Ari out here just putting out like all these.
I like looking at my phone. I'm like, okay, then.
No, but that's absolutely true. It's this concept of what is building home, right? For a lot of people, we're involved in this concept of finding the nation, right? Finding a nation when you've been chased outside of your homeland, you've been chased by conditions, you've been forced out of your homeland, right? Politically, socially, culturally, and certainly economically, right? But before we get to sort of the last part, and then open up to discussion with everyone here, I wanted to sort of look at this next reading as sort of thinking about what's at stake, right? This one isn't a poem. It's I actually had another poem that I was gonna read, but I swapped it out for this one last minute because I thought that it would be more appropriate for what we would then be talking about as we sort of transition into having this conversation between, like a three-way conversation here, right? Yeah. Everybody has to get on stage. No. But I'm hoping we can see this as sort of like thinking about what's at stake, right? This one's called Reynard's Song. He cupped his small hands around the spider and quickly blew through the gap between his thumb and his forefinger. Opening his hands, he saw the spider curled up as though it were asleep. Into the matchbox he put the spider, closing it shut. He stood and walked off, clutching the little prison with its little prisoner in his little hand. It was getting dark now, and the singing of birds had given way to the croaking of frogs. As he walked home, the rubber strap of one of his slippers came loose. Stopping and setting his matchbox down, he squatted to fix the troublesome footwear. The night air blew into his ear, ruffling his hair and giving him goosebumps as the sun set even lower. He was afraid, but he did not panic. As he worked at repairing his slipper, he began to hum. His mother taught him that. She said to Reynard that often songs help keep fear in check. So he hummed. He wasn't sure what song he was humming. He just hummed. He did not know if it was a song he'd heard or if he made it up himself. He just hummed. Suddenly, he heard rustling in the tall grass. He stopped humming and he listened. Silence. Not even the frogs were croaking anymore. He bent down again, working harder at his slipper, humming louder than before. He almost had it, just a little more. There. He stood up and started to run home. A loud bang erupted behind him. He was dead before he hit the ground. Soldiers surrounded his body. They swore and they whispered to each other. I thought he was a rebel. We can say he got in the way. We'll say the rebels did it. Let's go. People were coming from the village now, alerted by the loud blast. By the time they found the boy's body, the soldiers were gone. leaving boot prints in the soil, and the young child still clutching his little matchbox prison. That was Reynard's song. Events like that were a very typical occurrence in the province that I grew up, in the time that I grew up. The Gloria Arroyo years. We were talking about Gloria Arroyo earlier, Ari and I, when we were prepping. Gloria Arroyo was a president of the Philippines. She's still alive. She's still free. Actually, she's now the House Speaker of the House of Representatives. But this was the era that she was president in. One of the highest incidences of, or one of the highest sort of, the era that had one of the highest rates of murder of children by the armed forces of the Philippines, right? And every time this would happen, they would just say, oh, you know, they would force the newspapers to print that, oh, kids got in the way, or the rebels were using them as human shields. A lot of us who grew up there know that that's not the case. In my province alone, there were 3 teenagers who were hunting bats, right? They were hunting bats and other small animals in the forest a few towns over from where I grew up, Mahayhay, Laguna, and the military just opened fire on them. What all they said was, oh, we thought they were rebels, right? This is the sort of daily life occurrence. We started earlier with talking about rural life and talking about the tall grass. You notice I added the tall grass there again, but this is actually also what the tall grass hides, right? The reality of the everyday lived situation of our people in the Philippines, especially the impoverished people living under the rule of the landlords that use the armed forces of the Philippines as sort of their private army. You know, that's the kind of thing that inspires people to fight, that forces people to fight, really. And I'm hoping we could talk about a little bit about that resistance aspect.
Yeah, I'm still like thinking about that story. Well, I mean, going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think like one big part of the MPA is, you know, when I think from speaking to the different organized people that have come here from the Philippines, like, you know, the real terror is the government, right? Like the government armed by like U.S. imperialists. And I think oftentimes like you end up searching for something else, like from hearing these testimonials, and the only thing that's there is the MPA in terms of form of organization. And like going back to what we were talking about, like it isn't like they're greeting these people just with guns, right? They're greeting these people with like systems, with like, you know, trust, with confidence, you know, because like when the MPA leaves, like they set up a center, they leave it, and they leave it in the hands of villagers and people, more so as like a testament to show that they can control their own destinies, you know, like they are the people, and like there's trust in the people for that reason. Whereas like this is quite opposite, like you were saying, you know, with like landowners and the army, like they're used to terrorize people. They're used to like dislocate them and forcing them off of their property, off of their quote unquote property, you know?
It's exactly scenes like that that encourage people to be part of that struggle, to take full part in that struggle. I'm hoping we could talk about in a little bit, just, you know, the next couple minutes, and then we'll definitely open it up. But we could talk about, you know, the fact that there is, you know, something that isn't always mentioned, but there is that ongoing armed revolution in the Philippines. And I'm going to ask if Kate is here. Oh, cool. If Kate, if you wouldn't mind playing this video in the background while we talk about this. This is from a few years ago, or several years ago, I guess, right? But there is a very important role for the above ground legal democratic struggle, and I'm hoping we can talk about that after this part. But in the Philippines, for the last, 54 years now, just about 54 years, there has been an ongoing armed uprising against the government that causes these kinds of atrocities. The same government that killed Reynard and so many other people like Reynard, right? Reynard is a fictionalized version of so many, too many kids, too many people in the countryside and all over the Philippines and even all over the world. The way that the Marcos regime in the 80s killed Filipino activists, what was it? Blanking on their names. Silme Domingo, right? For example, right? Out in the West Coast, right? Their tentacles reach even to the diaspora, right? But there is a people's resistance in the Philippines, right? And there is this ongoing struggle that the government keeps complaining about. This boogeyman that the government keeps looking for in the successful strike, the successful transit strike. Sara Duterte, the vice president, said, oh, it's communist inspired. Everything, the community pantries at the beginning of the community pantries that were set up by people, legally set up by the people at the beginning of COVID-19, right? The government said, oh, that's just the communists, right? Well, let's look at why the Communist Party of the Philippines is still relevant and is still on their tongues 30 years after the end of the Cold War. This is the state of what they call the People's War in the Philippines. 73 out of 81 provinces have some form of red political power. That's power directly by the people, the most direct form of democracy. In a 2015 public statement, the Communist Party of the Philippines made a rare mention of the quantitative strength of the armed revolution, which includes more than 10,000 high-powered rifles manned by full-time red fighters. In the first 6 months of the Duterte presidency, this 10,000 increased to 11,000. More than 20,000 part-time or volunteer people's militia. And more than 200,000 armed self-defense units in the barrios and the municipalities, right? Meanwhile, the 2021 total for the Armed Forces of the Philippines active personnel is 143,000, right? With 360,000 as reserves. We are approaching a point that the civil war in the Philippines is getting closer and closer to parity, to an equal status between the government forces, the government of the landlords, and the power of the working class and the peasantry in the Philippines. This is exactly why the current Duterte Marcos regime, right, or Marcos Duterte, whichever you want to put first, it doesn't matter. The current regime of the landlords, right, is going all out to vilify even the legal democratic activists because they're afraid of this. This is the funeral march attended by about 12,000 people in Davao City, right? We've been talking, I don't know how many minutes it's been going on, Kate, but we've been talking this entire time. The entire time I've been talking, it's a sea of people who've come out in support of one of the commanders of the New People's Army, right? And yet the Philippine government calls them terrorists. I don't know. It looks like if the landlords think that they're terrorists, right? But the peasants and workers think that they're heroes, it looks like, you know, I don't know about you, but there's one side that I definitely want to believe more, right? This is not finished. I'm already finished explaining this part, and this is still ongoing.
Well, also like I think the other thing is that like, you know, again that last piece that Joma published before he passed away was, you know, essentially kind of one of the big points that he makes is like the ideological struggle. Do you know what I mean? Like these people are fighting for numbers of like literal dead bodies. Do you know, like they're saying, oh, we've killed 30,000. Oh, we've killed this many people. Oh, we've killed this many people. And it's like, what like sadistic form of like fighting are you trying? It's like completely reactionary, right? It's like a monster eating itself continuously in order to oppress itself. And I think like, whereas like the ideological struggle on the end of the working class movement and the MPA isn't one that is a united front. Like it's like, you know, like I don't want, you know, like all of a sudden like, you know, you hear like an orchestra playing behind me and like flags waving. But like seriously, like that is like really like, you know, like there is something more material in what is actually being fought for from the very beginning of that 54-year-old like civil war, right? And now where we're at today, if you look at a map, I wish we had the map up, but like where all like the red strongholds are throughout the Philippines, almost every province has a stronghold in it, you know? And that in itself is just like testament enough to how much the people trust was going on. Whereas like in the 80s and those time periods, you couldn't say the same, you know?
Right. It's getting to be just Metro Manila now that, wow, it's still going. I'm surprised. I'm the one who asked for this video to be put up, and I'm surprised it's still going. It's only Metro Manila now, the seat of the Philippine government's power, that is really free, quote unquote, from the political power of the people. The difference, right, and the reason, going back to that question, right, why is the Communist Party of the Philippines still relevant, right? Why is the armed revolution still relevant? And why Jose Maria Sison, his last, the great revolutionary Jose Maria Sison, you mentioned, Ari, his last piece. Why is the People's Democratic Revolution invincible? It's because the source of power for the ruling classes in the Philippines, for Marcos and Duterte, is the World Bank. Whereas the source of power for the People's Democratic Revolution have been directly the people in their literal tens of millions, right? Through every twist and turn, through every advance and defeat, it's been the people that's been their source of power. Unless the Marcos Duterte regime is able to cut that off, it will be invincible, right?
Yeah.
A lot of people in government say, oh, you know, this armed revolution is passé. Oh, it's been 54 years. Oh, how come they haven't won? Here's a better question. How come you haven't defeated them? With all the resources in the world, with literal multiple imperialists, multiple foreign governments supporting you, how can you have not defeated what you call a ragtag army of rebels? How have you not defeated them?
I think like the other thing also, and I was talking to an organizer from the Philippines about this, is that they send their children, I didn't know this, they send their children to like Marxist-Leninist camps where they like, it's like summer camp, but they learn about like Lenin's theory of like revolution and stuff. And they're like 6-year-olds that are like come back excited. And they're like, yeah, we're all like red fighters, you know, and they play like they play like MPA versus the army, like, you know, it's like as like a game, you know, like they're like, they see themselves
like cops
as
and robbers.
Yeah,
right,
exactly. But they see themselves as red fighters, like that. I think going to like the very bedrock of the ideological struggle, like outside, like, you know, cultural, ideological, material, like is so much more greater. Like, you know, no one's doing that in Metro Manila. No one's doing that on the like with like the bourgeois are doing that with their children. Like, you know, like no, they're maybe, yeah.
In many cases, they are.
They are, yeah.
The entire state
way.
apparatus is that. Yeah.
But I mean, I guess they're that level of like commitment to the next generation. And that's really what it is, I feel like, is that it's like you fight for the next generation. You're fighting for a future that has yet to be written, you know? And I think that's like super important, but yeah.
So that's that part of it, yeah, for sure. But in the midst of that, right, why is it that the legal democratic movement, including overseas advocacy and activism of organizations like Night Chirp, I know there's a few organizations here. I used to be part of an Akbayan. Whoa, what is that? If you're an AB, you know, give a shout out, you know?
It's like half the audience.
It's like half the audience. All right, I'm going home. No, but yeah, why is it that the legal democratic mass movement is not only a valid form of resistance, but an incredibly crucial form of resistance, right? Well, one thing, in 2015, late 2015 into 2016, you mentioned expo trips. I did an expo trip in the Philippines, one of my expo trips back home, which is funny because I grew up there.
Yeah,
so I was like a lot of people assumed that I was just, you know, I was from down the block or something. But we interviewed, it was a bit of an expo for me because it was in the city, right? And I grew up in the countryside, so I was completely lost. But one of the people that we interviewed, I went with a couple comrades from who founded within our lifetime, actually, they're Palestine Solidarity organizers, right? I went with a couple of them, and we met this older person. We didn't know what he was doing. He was like selling cell phone cases, you know, like the old Nokia.
Yeah, we say Nokia. We say Nokia. Yeah.
Nokia.
That's why I'm like, maybe I'm not, don't look at me.
the multicolored like Nokia cases, whatever, right? He was selling that. Turns out he used to be he used to be an officer in the New People's Army.
Whoa.
And he was like in his early 50s. He's not, active in that sense anymore. But he was during the Marcos regime, right? And like he caught the tail end of the Marcos regime and then throughout the 90s. And he had so many stories. And I happened to mention that, because I mentioned earlier before that I was with Anak Bayan, right? A legal democratic organization. And then I felt intimidated because he's like, here's this revolutionary, like this grizzled figure. He was kind of like intimidating looking in many respects. And then he's like, what you're doing is important. Yeah. What you're doing is really good. He was like really excited like that. He's like, oh, okay, wow. And he'd spent 15 years of his life as a commander in the New People's Army in Southern Tagalog region, right?
Yeah.
So that, hearing that was really something because it shows the validity and shows that in any form of struggle, right, we cannot let the Philippine government and their allies overseas, we cannot let them have a moment's peace. Even in the halls of the worst halls of parliamentary struggle are actually important. We cannot let them have we can't give them a single inch in the struggle for liberation. And that's actually, in my view, why the legal democratic struggle is still a very, very important, valid, and crucial contributor to the overall struggle for national liberation in the Philippines.
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely... I'm like talking to like a bunch of Anak Bayan people, so I'm like, I hope I have my ND right here, ND movement ideas right here. But no, but like it's like I think it's also really important because there are other movements that have referenced in the past like 54 years. They've referenced the ND movement in the Philippines, like the Black Liberation Movement, particularly in America, has looked at Joma and looked at what the MPA and the above ground underground have done as like an ideal to strive for because it's super specific but it can be generalized and internationalized in a way that's really important. That like the underground can be like the MPA, but it's like the League of Lawyers, religious, theological officials, like students, writers, cultural figure, like that mass movement is such a large tide that a government, as we saw in the 70s, in the 60s in America during the Vietnam War, like couldn't push up against and had to go through more insidious routes to break apart, Yeah.
We have one of the most threatened churches in the world. I hate that whenever you look at Filipinos number one at something, right? Whenever you Google something like that, it's always something bad. It's always terrible. And I've learned to like, let me not do this. Are we number one in dumping garbage in the ocean? Apparently we are. Apparently we are by like 200,000 metric tons. But really that's garbage.
I was going to say,
it's not our garbage. Exactly.
US military?
It's garbage. Yeah. It's garbage from the US, from Canada, and from Japan, right? But we're also number one in terms of, you said lawyers, journalists right now, who are threatened and who are killed. The Philippines is the number one most dangerous country right now. We overtook our siblings in Brazil at being number one in terms of journalists being killed. Churches, right? We have one of the most threatened churches in the world, the Iglesia Filipina Independiente, the IFI. Some folks may know about them because they're constantly called, oh, this is a nest or a headquarters of communism, right? It's a church. Leave us alone, like with that. This is the situation of the people's resistance, and the government being afraid and finding this boogeyman of communism everywhere is just a reflection of their own failings, their own failure to provide anything for the people, right? Yeah. I was hoping you could also speak to us about. Thank you. I was hoping you could also speak to us, Ari, about a little bit about the human rights advocacy, for example, that NITRIP does.
Oh yeah. Oh man, I feel like I've talked so much already. The human rights advocacy. Looking over my NITRIP comrades over there. Huh?
Okay, yeah, we do. I think like I started this conversation off. We do a lot. Um, just generally like a big part of our thrusts and what we want to do as an organization involve immediate ending to the funding of the U.S. government to the Philippines. Big part of that is the FRA, which is the Philippine Human Rights Act. I'm sure a lot of people here are familiar with it. If you're not, we have a desk over there where you can learn more about it. But it's really, really important because, like, as we mentioned, there are real big budgetary issues and money issues going to the Philippines. Like with that 5% figure, 5% of the medical budget being only allocated to real medical needs. Like those are real discrepancies in numbers. And on many different, like looking at it from a Philippine standpoint or looking at it from an American perspective from here in the Imperial Core, this money, I mean, we're talking about what's on books. This isn't even the billions of dollars that are sent, through private contracts and other different means like multinationals and things. But what the US government sends is billions upon billions of dollars. And I think it was like just recently, like they sent like $50 billion, but they send it for state surveillance and security is what they say. But more importantly, it's to arm and kill Filipinos, whether they're actually NPA, like communist rebels, or they're like Reynard, like in the story that you mentioned. So that's something that's always ongoing. It's being reintroduced, or it has been reintroduced, and we're looking to revamp our support behind that bill. We definitely find it also really important as a bridge to talk to people, because I think, like we've been talking about, it isn't something that is just native to the Philippines, like this fear of communism, fear of leftism. But I think like most Americans and, anyone really can agree, hey, we shouldn't be sending money to go kill innocent people, as well as when you look at what the money at home is being sent to in comparison to the SVB, like the Silicon Valley Bank situation. I mean, we can go down the line. I mean, just in that amount of money alone, like the money that we sent to the Philippines, we could be investing into cultural institutions, educational institutions. So it's a very big part of what we do, obviously, is the FRA. The next part is ending. I mean, it's funny. I was hoping you were going to mention the Asian Society. Like you were saying the halls of, and I was like, the Asian Society. Well, we're bringing more media attention, more educational attention, and you can follow us at Night Chirp. We're going to be doing more information sessions about this. But state repression of activists, both here and abroad, it's something that, I mean, it's like frustrating to even think about, but there's people within our own organizations, their own coalitions that are being targeted by the Philippines government. But I mean, this, again, when we work as a united front, it's more than just organizers, it's more than just activists. I mean, you have lawyers that come to America and do tours, and one was killed in Philadelphia, I think it was like 7 or 8 months ago. So the extent to which state repression exists, from the PNP to the NYPD, or we're talking about like, the consulate, we're talking about like Marcos doing just a casual visit to the Asian Society where like literal children are going to learn and take classes, and like the next day a fascist just coming to step in and do a speech. Like these people shouldn't be allowed to step a foot anywhere, do you know what I mean, without being yelled at. And I think that is something that's really, I mean, has become more important to us as an organization. And then the other really, really big thrust, and something that I really want to touch on and I mentioned before, is international labor solidarity. I mean, we are an international solidarity organization. So we do stuff with like Palestine. We do stuff with New York Barrico Resistance, as we did that labor panel, and that Treaty of Paris panel. The one where Nico spoke at. What? Who else? Who else is here? No. You're going to get it. Just turned really weird. But, well, yeah, so we do international solidarity, but really what we're trying to focus on is build with unions here and unions over there, workers here and workers over there, because I think, like, this is its own lecture, but to sum it up, I mean, when people go on strike here, where do these multinationals go? They're multinationals for a reason. They go to what is thought of as the third world. They go to cheap labor. They go and find like a great example actually is Bien, where we talk about Bien and the strike. It was a strike in support of Bien went on strike to not take on American contracts for call center work when call centers were going on strike in America. So we're trying to reproduce that and create greater connections between the working class here and over there, specifically for things like that, to keep people in communication and, to strengthen our understanding, I guess, of the global class structure. So, I mean, this is kind of an ask for anybody, really. If you want to be involved more, we are actually trying to go to the Philippines and bring labor organizers over there and to meet labor organizers in the Philippines. If you know any unions, if you know any organizers, if you know anyone that does this kind of work that would be interested in sort of international solidarity work, definitely reach out to us. You can follow us again, like at NightChirp on Instagram. You can talk to our wonderful Kasamas over there who are just chomping at the bit to talk to you about international solidarity. They want to talk to you about the FRA. And I'm looking at all these people that have been at FRA events. So I'm kind of like, y'all know about it. But if you don't know about it, seriously, it is really, I want to reiterate, I think, as someone, I am like the child of refugees. Like my parents came here not because they wanted to, but because they were like, well, you can't get bombed in America by America. So like, let's go there. But, right, or so they thought. Move organization? No, I'm talking, not really, but. And I think like the big point is that like the Philippines is obscured specifically, right? Like it is always taught. I remember being taught as a child in U.S. history class, the first colonial subject outside of America was the Philippines, as if it was something that was just like, that was our gambit as an imperial nation, was the Philippines, right? And then it gets dropped and the Philippines is never mentioned again, right? And how many times we've been at events, how many times I've been at actions talking to people who are unfamiliar with the situation. They're like, whoa, something's going on in the Philippines? And I'm like, listen, my brother, things have been going on in the Philippines for decades, right? And like, but the reason I say that is that I was someone who didn't know that much about it. And I felt really connected because I grew up around a lot of Filipinos in New York City specifically. And I just wanted to learn, and I showed up to a NightChirp event. And actually I signed up through a newsletter through the People's Forum, funny enough. All comes full circle. That's why I'm always here. And it was such a cataclysmic moment for me. And I really like urge, even if you don't know anything about the Philippines, like come over and talk again. If you're on like the live stream, I think we're live. Yeah. If you're on the live stream and you want to know anything about like NightChirp, or you don't know anything about the Philippines, this is your introduction. You know Mike, and you love Mike's Tagalog classes, which is, yeah, like reach out to us. Like do not feel afraid at all. We will take as much time as necessary to talk to you. So yeah, that's like kind of my spiel, I guess, as a NightChirp organizer. Yeah.
Thanks. And that's also our spiel in general for tonight.
Yep.
I do want to make sure that we have time for some announcements that Saidi wants to give, but that we want to hear. But in the next couple minutes, we wanted to open it up to folks, see if there were any questions, thoughts, violent reactions. Whoa. But yeah, if folks wanted to share, what they thought or have any questions.
Hello, Mike Legaspi.
Oh no.
No, it's really coming from Dana, who had unfortunately had to leave early, and so I'm reading on their behalf. And I guess it's also a question, not just about poetry, but also like I guess different vessels of artistry, right? So also extending this question beyond poetry too. But their question is, what does it mean to you to write pro-people poetry? Sometimes, and them as a fellow poet, right? Mainstream poetry, as we're taught, it can be elitist and separate from the people. And so how do you navigate this contradiction?
Nice. Okay, all pressure to answer the question. Okay, yeah. Thanks, Bea and Dana. um, yeah. I mean, like, for me, like, we don't have to categorize mainstream and revolutionary or pro people poetry, right, or art in general. Um, I'm going to borrow from the New Democratic Revolution in India here, because one of their great thinkers and artists actually answered this question in this way, and it really framed how I've thought about art and poetry in particular for the last 10 years, right? Is like, we don't have to worry so much about the mainstream if we are putting ourselves in the mainstream. If we're always in the mainstream if we are people who organize amongst the majority of the people, right? The mainstream that we think about in terms of the ruling classes, right, is just their half of the mainstream. We need to fight to become the mainstream. We need to fight to make it more popular. And popular art in its best form, I think, is the art that captures the thoughts, the feelings, and the anger, as well as the love of the people fighting back. So I think that's what I would say, is that we should make or view revolutionary and pro-people art as something to be put into the mainstream. I hope that was somewhat coherent. Thanks. Any other folks wanted to ask, questions or share thoughts before we wrap up tonight? As we wrap up tonight. Flip it.
Hi. Thank you so much for sharing your poems and speaking about them. I guess so I was really interested to hear, like, when you shared the first poem, some of the other, like, images and things you were thinking about that didn't make it into that poem. And I'm sort of curious, like, do you have other bits or pieces that didn't make it into this collection that are still with you, that still feel connected to it, that you would like to share with us, or that you feel like you'll be expanding on later, maybe?
Thanks, Bev. Yeah. So short answer is yes, but not gonna be sharing them tonight in the next 30 seconds. But yes, for sure. I purposefully made it not to. One, I didn't add Tagalog poetry, and I also didn't add, like Sambal poetry, another Philippine language, right? But I did that on purpose, right? I wanted to have this first one be in English. I am writing another book. That Reynard's song is actually part of a larger collection of short stories that I've written the introduction in my head. I haven't written all the short stories yet, but I'm working on it, I promise. But it's not necessarily that they're sad stories, and they're also not necessarily happy stories. They're just stories. That's literally it. That's the introduction. That's, they're just stories, and they're meant to talk about what's going on in the Philippines. It's also what's going on in diaspora. So yeah, there's more. I hope to write more if folks are interested. I've also been just writing for myself, so it's fine. But yeah, thanks.
Sorry, you're not gonna like my question. It kind of going off of Dana's question or your response to it, and I go on this tangent a lot, so like half the people here probably have heard it, but how there's like a cultural war going on, particularly in New York, with like the Philippine consulate being here, and that particularly after the elections last year, they have been putting on more cultural programs to attract and like rebuild trust with the Filipino community, especially after they like fuck over the voting process here. And we just see a lot of a lot of Filipino American, like theater, fashion, like music, and then obviously we have the Imelda Marcos musical coming to Broadway this summer. And we even see, progressive artists like having nuanced takes of Here Lies Love, etc. is live streamed. But so I think just just really feeling the sharpness of like the cultural work that we need to do here, the aspect of that cultural rev, like publicly with the masses. As you know, Mao wrote about the cultural rev. And as you also know, I made that ABNY study, is the revolution will not be Instagram, where it talks about collective like culture and culture and art making, which as like a writer and like a visual artist, like it can be very insular, like privately done, because it's also a very intimate process. And I also know that you, have intentions of like more collaborative, collective cultural work. And I'm wondering just like, your own, if you want to like give a sneak preview to those things, and also like maybe advice to our mass organizations here on how they can engage in that like cultural work collectively to engage in this cultural war against like the very strong state is here in New York, Northeast.
Thanks for that, Amanda. So yes, I do hope to share more. Obviously, again, not tonight, but what I think can happen and would be really great if it could happen are more events having to do with cultural expression, right? We want to look at culture and art as an expression of, our not only of our ideas and our feelings, but our everyday struggles, right? And I think, the Philippine consulate doing their thing, that's fine. We can do our own, right? We can be the People's Consulate, right? We already have the People's Forum, The People's Forum are already really great, right? But for us, as for a lot of Filipino organizers, we can assert ourselves and, take that spotlight away from them, right? You mentioned Mao. Well, what did he say? Let 100 flowers bloom and 100 schools of thought contend. Let's see who wins. That's what I think.
I also want to add with Mao, which I think is like something that's always inspired me, is that like Mao's like beginning of his organizing was setting up like women's journals. Like he just went to like radical women's organizations in like the 1920s and was like, or the 1910s, and we need to like start writing stories, short stories, poems about Chinese women and the struggles that they go through in the proletariat. And I think like that's really important. I think there's like also power in like alternative in that sense. Like, I mean, it's like in every part of history, but yeah, like I agree. I think like, fuck them. Like, why do we, we don't, have you been to the Philippine consulate? Like, do you want to put a show on in there? No, but I mean, like in reality, yeah, like we need to find our own spaces for sure.
Thank you. So I'm Susanna. I came here with May. So Mike Legaspi. Okay. I just wanted to know, because I am an off and on poet, and you're obviously a poet, for what I could see here. When you were conveying your different poetry, I haven't read your book yet. Do you feel like, do you leap back into an era of your childhood, or do you feel like it's still very present with you now when you write it, when you read it? How does it, is it disconnect? Is it reconnect? Is it separation? Like, how do you feel about that process?
Thanks, Susanna. That's a poet's poet question. Yeah, I'm like about to. I mean, honestly, I do. I should, and I'd like to think more about that as part of the process. But especially this book going back in time, for sure. I think about not just my experiences, but those of others that I've been close with, my family, friends, and so on, and growing up and coming up, I guess, coming of age in the U.S. also with a lot of my kasamas, a lot of my comrades, right, in the everyday struggle. But one thing that I try to link between the past and the present is writing as much of what I understand to be real as possible. If I put at least one, there's this. Some folks may not like this, but just remember that he was what do you call that? A KGB operative at a point. It's kind of funny. There's an Ernest Hemingway quote, right, about write one true sentence, right? I promise Ernest Hemingway is like the whitest guy that I read, but he did say write one true sentence, right? And to me, that I read that in A Movable Feast, and I thought like, oh, that's really important, right? Write at least one true sentence and then build everything around that. Let everything grow from it, or put the pieces in there as much as you can. And that's what poetry's been about. That's what a lot of the other writing things that I'm doing right now has been about. So yeah, I hope that answers the question. Any other questions or thoughts before we close tonight? I think when I mentioned Hemingway, everybody's like, "It's not. I'm just joking."
You're canceled.
You're not a real poet. Yeah. Oh, you like him.
I promise it's not too deep. Hello, my name is Rosette. So I guess I'm currently like doing my research on like preserving Filipino culture through food. So I guess my question is pretty much like, because you are remembering like your entire life, what dish is it that like actually helps you preserve your culture, and also like what helps you remember home?
That's a really good question, Rosette. And I know you said it's not too deep, but it's actually, I eat a lot. So so it is deep for me. So I made the joke earlier about it's Filipino adobo day. According to Google, it's Filipino adobo day or something, right? They had their doodle. But to me, it's really most of the things. For example, I didn't grow up with sisig. Sisig is largely from our Kapampangan siblings. There's different cuisines, right? There's no one Filipino cuisine. Like there's no one Filipino language, says the language instructor. But for me, when it comes to dishes, it's really a lot of the. Ironically, it's dishes that I don't like tinola, like pancit. Yeah, I know. Oh, pancit. Mike doesn't like pancit. Yes, no, I don't. I'm like super Pinoy in everything else, but I don't like pancit and I don't like tinola. And the reason why that reminds me of home so much is because of my grandfather. See, in my household where I grew up, I was raised by my grandparents and my mom, right? But my mom was working overseas. My mom is a single mom. I didn't have my father around. But my grandfather was the one who was cooking. Every day he was going to go to the palengke at like 5 in the morning, right? Sometimes he'd bring me. And then I'm groggy-eyed. And then by 9 a.m., he has all these things set out. And he always cooked things that I just don't quite like. Although he did cook great things like menudo and adobo, right? A lot of folks like menudo, adobo, bistek, right? Right? A lot of here, kare-kare, and he was amazing at that. I used to when I was a kid, I used to help him ground the peanuts as part of the kare-kare paste, right? But because we never use peanut butter, right? But the things that remind me most about home are actually the dishes that remind me most about him. And it's the ones that are his favorite, actually. The ones that I dislike. Pancit, tinola, sopas. So, yeah, it's those ones. But thanks for asking that.
Everyone, let's give another round of applause. Thank you, Mike and Ari, for that. That was really amazing.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks for having me.
I mean, it's really important work. I think a lot of folks, we try to separate the political and the cultural, but this was really important to remind us that, they build off of each other, they're intertwined with each other, we can't separate them, they're hand in hand. So thank you for that. Thank you all for showing up today. Woo, it's really cold and windy. Even I was like, ooh, I don't want to do that, but thank you all so much. As I mentioned earlier, if you're interested, please join us on our bus on this Saturday. We have like 20 more seats left. We're trying to put all the cool people in, so of course you have to be there. It's going to be really important and really powerful. So hope you join us, ask us any questions, and thank you all for coming out today. Have a wonderful evening.